I think many of us look back on particular moments in our childhood that just stick with us. Some of those moments are seemingly random, arbitrary memories that we wonder why those remain. And others had such a distinct impression on us that we can remember that impression, and it makes sense why it would stick with us. One such memory for me was when I was a kid. I was probably about 8 years old. There was one thing I desperately wanted for Christmas. This is going to sound weird. What I desperately wanted for Christmas as a kid in the 80s was a toy called My Pet Monster. My Pet Monster was a giant, stuffed, grotesque monster that you would, put in your bed, wrestle with, whatever. I loved it. I loved the idea of this thing. He had these little shackles on his wrists that were Velcro, and the chain would break apart. I wanted this thing so badly. And I was hoping against hope that my parents would buy this for me for Christmas. And I remember one day I was playing up in my room, and I came downstairs, and I think my mom must have thought I was occupied, and I saw my mom trying to sneak Christmas presents into the house, and I saw My Pet Monster. And my mom looked at me, and she knew that I saw it. Very little was exchanged there. I don't know exactly what. It was an awkward moment. And for the next few weeks, I was devastated because I thought, I've ruined this. It goes against the Christmas code to see your presents. And so I became convinced that because I had seen this present, I was not going to get it. That somehow it negated the validity of this present for me to have seen it and spoiled the surprise ahead of time. So imagine my surprise when on Christmas morning I opened My Pet Monster. Ironically, I was much more surprised that I had gotten it than if I had never seen that my mom had already bought it. Sometimes child logic is a funny thing. But it's funny, I thought that I had messed up my parents' plan for me. And so my hope for Christmas morning, which is like the fundamental yearly hope of every child, it was tainted. It was shaken. Because I thought, well, my parents had this great plan for me, and now it's messed up. Of course, I didn't ruin anything. We can face situations, circumstances, factors, people in our lives, and not just in our circumstances, but in our hearts, that are so overwhelming, that shake us so much, that while we may not actively think that our eternal hope is threatened by these things, we may act like it is. Having a heart that's too concerned in the wrong kinds of ways with what may be happening in our lives right now. What we're going to see in our passage today in the book of Esther, if you want to turn to Esther chapter 5 with me, is that no matter what we may think of our life circumstances, no matter how pleasant or mundane or difficult they might be, what we know to be true is that God is always powerfully and sovereignly working out his good plan for his people. He always is. The book of Esther, as we've been looking at for just a couple weeks here, is a remarkable book. One, it gives us a snapshot of life in the dispersion. That is to say, after the Jews are exiled, when Nebuchadnezzar comes into Jerusalem and brings the final blow of devastation by destroying the temple, driving the people out. The Jews have now been living for quite a while in exile, spread out, trying to assimilate as best they can into the cultures of the places where they live. It's been long enough that Nebuchadnezzar and the seemingly invincible Babylonian Empire has been defeated by the Persian Empire. And what we see here is a picture of God's faithful, patient, consistent working out of his plan for his people in the midst of a situation in which God seems nowhere to be found. And that sentiment is acknowledged powerfully by the fact that the writer of Esther never mentions God once in the book. And yet shows us how, despite there being a lack of supernatural interventions like we see in so much of the Old Testament, the angel of the Lord coming down, a flaming bush, God speaking in an audible voice to someone, that God is powerfully at work to preserve, to protect, and to cause his people to flourish. If you look at the outline in your bulletin, the book of Esther is a chiasm. That is to say, a book in which the center of the book is the linchpin of the story, and all of the sections of the book leading into it parallel each other, or I should say parallel the opposite section leading out of the book. I've tried to indicate that by the indentations in the outline. But here we're going to see the sort of culmination of Esther's obedience, her risk in confronting the king, and her obedience in light of God's working out what seems like a totally impossible situation from a human perspective. No matter what we might think of our life circumstances, God is always powerfully working out his good plan for his people. We see this in three different ways in this passage that are applicable to us, things that we can remember when we're facing difficult or uncertain circumstances. And the first one is this: God uses weak people to accomplish his plan. He uses weak people. Look with me at Esther chapter 5, verse 1. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, in front of the king's quarters, while the king was sitting on his royal throne inside the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. To capture the significance of this moment, we have to remember that in chapter 4, after the edict has come from the king, who was prompted by Haman to present this law, this decree that on a particular day in the near future, everyone throughout the entire Persian Empire was commanded to kill any Jews that they knew, man, woman, and child, to kill them and to plunder their goods. Esther, her Jewish name being Hadassah, had been, by God's sovereignty, brought into the royal household to become King Ahasuerus' queen. And Mordecai, Esther's uncle, reminds her that she will not be safe from this genocide because she's queen, and that God has perhaps placed her in this position in order to be the instrument of deliverance for his people. Because initially, when he presents this to her, he says, look, you're queen. You, out of anybody, can go before the king and plead for the lives of your people. And Esther says, no, I'm too scared. If I go before the king into his royal court without having been summoned by him, he has the option to simply kill me for being so audacious. And he says, Mordecai says to her, this is probably why you're queen in the first place. So here Esther, a couple days later, puts on her royal robes and is in that moment of truth about to approach the king in a way that may mean her immediate execution. It's important to see here something small in what seems to be simply a narrative descriptor of the situation that was happening. But what we see here is a woman who we've already seen is scared, is not certain what to do, but is going to press forward in obedience anyway. In verse 2, and when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won favor in his sight. He held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. Just as God granted favor to Esther with the king's servants and with the king himself in chapter 2 in order to bring this situation about, we see the same kind of thing happening here. It's made plain that Esther did not do anything in particular, one, to become queen. God had just made her very physically beautiful. And that Esther did not do anything in order to convince the king to spare her life in this moment. But God granted her favor in his eyes because he was the one directing the situation. He was the one who was compelling the king to act in the way that he wanted him to. He was the one that was preserving Esther in order that she might come before the king. Esther did not do anything to make this situation happen. And then we see their conversation starting in verse 3. And the king said to her, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given you even to the half of my kingdom." And Esther said, "If it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to a feast that I've prepared for the king." And the king said, "Bring Haman quickly so that we may do as Esther has asked." So the king and Haman came to the feast that Esther had prepared. Esther is planning a dinner with the king who is intimidating. We know from chapter 1 that because of a very mild act of non-compliance from the previous queen, Queen Vashti, he exiled her forever. Part of that is his officials convinced him to do so. So we see a hot-headed, impulsive king who is also easily swayed by his advisors. Esther is calling together King Ahasuerus and his chief advisor Haman, the man who is dead set on killing all the Jews, to a dinner, just the three of them, in order to convince the king not to do it. In other words, to listen to her rather than to Haman. That had to be profoundly intimidating. So in verse 6, and as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king said to Esther, "What is your wish? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled." Then Esther answered, "My wish and my request is, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my wish and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come to the feast that I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said." The stage is set. The king has just enjoyed a feast in which he's very positively inclined towards Esther. It's plain. What is all this about, Esther? Tell me anything that you want. I will grant it to you. And Esther says, "Well, here's my big request. This is the whole reason I put together this banquet, was to invite you and Haman to another banquet tomorrow." In other words, Esther is scared. She's scared. She thinks, why do this now? Maybe tomorrow I'll have the courage to ask him. She puts it off because it's too scary, but even in the next couple of chapters, we're going to see that Esther's procrastination is even a part of God's plan to orchestrate things just right. In other words, Esther's fearfulness did not mess up God's plan. Esther did not become queen because of her abilities, because of her resume, because of her accomplishments. And God was not going to rescue his people because of a plan that relied on Esther nailing it. We are so aware of our weaknesses in so many ways. Sometimes we may think, surely God wants to use better qualified Christians than us. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 26 to 31, Paul says, "For consider your calling, brothers. Not many of you were wise according to worldly standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, even things that are not, to bring to nothing things that are, so that no human being might boast in the presence of God. And because of him, you are in Christ Jesus, who became to us wisdom from God, righteousness and sanctification and redemption, so that, as it is written, let the one who boasts boast in the Lord." This might sound a little bit like a backhanded compliment from Paul in 1 Corinthians 1 to say, cheer up, guys. The world thinks you're dumb. The world thinks you're foolish. The world doesn't think you amount to much. But guess what? That doesn't matter in God's economy. When we wonder whether we have what it takes to face our life circumstances, if we wonder if we're qualified, if we're strong enough, or clever enough, or have the kind of fortitude that we need to overcome the things that come our way, we can rest in the knowledge that we don't. We can rest in the certainty of our inadequacy, knowing that that simply is irrelevant when it comes to God working out his good plan for us. God uses weak people, unimpressive people, scared, fragile, fickle people like us to accomplish his plan. Secondly, we should remember that God's plan is to raise up his people. Raise up his people. Look at verse 9 of chapter 5. And Haman went out that day joyful and glad of heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he neither rose nor trembled before him, he was filled with wrath against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home, and he sent and brought his friends and his wife Zeresh. And Haman recounted to them the splendor of his riches, the number of his sons, all the promotions with which the king had honored him, and how he had advanced him above the officials and the servants of the king. Haman is bothered. He's been promoted to the second most powerful man in the kingdom by the king. He's been celebrated. He's been honored. And none of this means anything to him because it bugs him so much that Mordecai the Jew won't give him the respect he feels he deserves. All these other things, these accolades and accomplishments and promotions that he has, mean absolutely nothing to him when compared to the fact that there's this one Jewish guy that won't bow down to him. And so in order to comfort himself, he says, I need my wife and my friends to come together so I can have a little party where I brag about how great I am. Then Haman said, verse 12, Even Queen Esther, let no one but me come with the king to the feast she prepared, and tomorrow also I'm invited by her together with the king. Yet all this is worth nothing to me so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate." Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, "Let a gallows 50 cubits high be made, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged upon it. Then go joyfully with the king to the feast." This idea pleased Haman, and he had the gallows made. If you remember, earlier when Haman, who didn't even notice Mordecai, was told by his servants that Mordecai didn't bow down to him when he went through the streets, decided, I'm not going to just have Mordecai killed. I'm going to be patient, bide my time. I'm going to have all the Jews destroyed. If you remember, the writer of Esther mentions to us that Haman was an Agagite. That is to say, an Amalekite who was a descendant of King Agag, a family that King Saul had been commanded by God to wipe out, and chose to overcome King Agag and the Agagites in a half-hearted way, letting some of them go, taking some of their stuff. And the Jews here in Esther are coming to regret that. But initially, Haman is trying to be patient, clever, pays the king 10,000 talents of silver in order to let him decree a genocide against all the Jews. And yet, Haman just can't wait. It bothers him so much because he's so concerned with his own efforts to exalt himself that he cannot stand another day with Mordecai disrespecting him like this. And so his friends and his wife say, well, tell you what, make a gallows, which is not really a gallows. We think about that like where you would hang somebody on a noose. That's not what this is referring to here. They didn't do that in ancient Persia. They made giant spikes that you would stick somebody on, impale them on. And his wife says, I've got a great idea. Tell you what, let's just have a 75-foot stake made. Tomorrow you can just ask the king, can I impale Mordecai the Jew on this? Then this won't be bothering you anymore. And you can just be happy and go to this feast with Esther and enjoy your success. He says that's a great idea. Now, even as we are confronted here, at the middle of the book, with Haman's motivations, Haman's character laid bare, we're reaching the sort of the apex of tension in this book where we think this just doesn't seem like a plan that the Jews or that Esther, this scared girl, will be able to overcome. Haman, this man who is so respected, this man who is so authoritative and is so influential for the king's decision-making, has decided he's going to have Mordecai impaled tomorrow. And we have to think, boy, if Esther, who is trying to work up the courage to confront the king about this, sees her uncle dead on a pole at Haman's hands, how much must that just simply undermine her resolve to go through with this? And so something remarkable happens that at first does not seem remarkable. This book is filled with these kinds of things. Our lives are filled with these kinds of things. Look at chapter 6, verse 1. On that night, the king could not sleep. This is the linchpin of the entire narrative right here. Things seem insurmountable for the Jews. The instrument of God's deliverance is a scared woman who lives in the shadow of a queen who had been exiled for stepping slightly out of line according to the king's perceptions. Haman, second in command over the entire Persian Empire, has just made a pole so that in the morning he might impale Mordecai the Jew on it. And here we see something remarkable. On that night, the king could not sleep. The king just happens to have insomnia this night. So, second part of verse 1, and he gave orders to bring the book of memorable deeds, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. Like so many other moments in this story, we see in a subtle way God working out things according to his plan. The king says, I can't sleep. He also probably couldn't read. So he brings servants to find the book of just interesting historical things that have happened during his reign and read them back to him. Verse 2. And it was found written how Mordecai had told about Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, who guarded the threshold and who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And the king said, what honor or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? The king's young men who attended him said, nothing has been done for him. We remember earlier in this book, Mordecai the Jew, who had every reason to hate and resent King Ahasuerus, because even before Haman's influential decree to exterminate all the Jews, Esther, his beloved niece Hadassah, had been kidnapped, taken to a harem, objectified, and made queen. And yet Mordecai overhears a plot against the life of the king by two of his servants, tells Esther to pass this along, and absolutely nothing is done to acknowledge or recognize Mordecai in this. The two servants are executed, the king's life is spared, and Mordecai gets absolutely no recognition for this. And Mordecai doesn't clamor for any, as far as we know. And it doesn't seem fair. It's not. But what we see here, remarkably, is, according to God's plan, why that acknowledgement was delayed. On this night, the night before, Haman is going to come in the morning and ask the king to impale Mordecai, this random Jew, on a pole, which otherwise the king almost certainly would have said, of course, I don't know any Mordecai. Impale anyone you want. Verse 4. And the king said, who is in the court? Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to speak with the king about having Mordecai hanged on the gallows that he had prepared for him. Haman was coming in just at this moment, as seconds after the king has been informed, we never did anything to recognize this hero, Mordecai the Jew, who saved your life. Haman is coming in at that moment to say, hey, there's this Jew named Mordecai I would love to impale on a pole. And the king's young men told him, Haman is here, standing in the court. And the king said, let him come in. So Haman come in, and the king said to him, what should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor? And we know Haman's character, the way he's going to take this question, this seemingly hypothetical question. Because it says, and Haman said to himself, whom would the king delight to honor more than me? Because that's how Haman thinks. And Haman said to the king, because his plan is to exalt himself, right? We've already seen this. That is what he's consumed by. And Haman thinks, this is my chance. And Haman said to the king, for the man whom the king delights to honor, this hypothetical guy, let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn, and the horse that the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown is set. And let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. Let them dress the man whom the king delights to honor, and let them lead him on the horse through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Haman is essentially designing a celebratory event for himself. Verse 10, then the king said to Haman, hurry, take the robes and the horse, as you have said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you have mentioned. That is a great idea, Haman. That is perfect. So, I've got a guy in mind. He's a guy I really respect, a guy I owe a lot to. His name is Mordecai. He's a Jew. You might know him. He sits at the gate. So Haman took the robes and the horse, and he dressed Mordecai and led him through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Well, that didn't quite go as Haman expected. Haman thought, in a very real sense, this is the last nail in the coffin. I know I've got this plan to exterminate all the Jews, but I cannot tolerate Mordecai being around even one day longer. And so as Haman, in his desire to exalt himself, instead finds himself humiliated. His desire to exalt himself to a level higher than he's experienced yet means he is humiliated in a more profound way than he could ever imagine. To lead Mordecai the Jew on a horse with a royal robe and a crown through the city to an adulating crowd on parade, declaring him as a man that the king delights to honor. It's a funny turn of events, but it also reinforces the theme of this book, which is God exalting the humble and humbling the proud by way of his plan of salvation for his people. God's working for the good of his people, and he will confound the plans of their enemies. And we see that pictured in the representative individual examples of Mordecai and Haman. And so after this profoundly humiliating experience, in verse 12, then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house mourning and with his head covered. And Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him. Now we know a couple days before, Haman felt humiliated by Mordecai. Boy, he had no idea. And he goes home to his wife and his friends, and they comfort him. They say, hey, listen, this Mordecai, what does he know? Have a big pole made, you're going to impale him on it, and tomorrow you'll just feel better after you get to execute this guy. Don't worry about this guy. He's just some random Jew. And Haman comes home and tells them, boy, the worst day I have ever had at work was today. You can't believe what happened. I was going in to tell the king what you told me I should say, and instead I had to lead Mordecai on a celebratory parade through the city. And we might expect, because the situations are a little parallel, that Zeresh, his wife, and his friends would say, you know what, tomorrow just go in again. Go for it again. Say you want to hang this guy, and then you'll feel better about it. Look at the second part of verse 13. Then his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of the Jewish people, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him. This is probably not the encouragement that Haman expected from his family. But his wife and his friends can see what's happening. They know the history. They say, you know what? What this means is, this is just the beginning of your undoing by the God of the Jewish people. There's nothing you can do to stop this. We were afraid of this. The fact that he's a Jew means you're going to be the one to fall. It doesn't matter what your position is. It doesn't matter your cleverness. It doesn't matter the workings of your scheming. We know you're a clever guy. We know you're an ambitious guy. We know you have the ear of the king. We know you've been promoted so many times, but we also know, we can see, as heartless pagan people who care nothing for God's laws, that if history has shown anything, it is that the God of the Jews preserves his people. And if his plan is for you to fall before this random guy who sits at the gate, then you will. And that your downfall has only just begun. Haman's friends and family, the ones who were laughing yesterday about building a pole to stick Mordecai on, are seeing that the God of Israel won't be stopped. It's plain that God will raise up his people and defeat his enemies. It became clear to Haman's friends and family that God's plan for his people was to save them and raise them to a place of prominence, no matter how ambitious Haman was to do that for himself. We know that so much more fully than they did. That God's plan was to ransom his people through Christ and give them a place to reign with him as kingdom children. Daniel prophesies about this in chapter 7 of his book, verse 27. He says, "And the kingdom and the dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High. His kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him." Like Mordecai and Esther, our eyes should not be fixed on our circumstances. They should be fixed on our hope, the fulfillment of God's plan for us, a good plan that can't be stopped, it can't be threatened. If we look for hope and joy in the circumstances around us, that joy will be shallow and it will be fragile. But when we remember what God has in store for us, it helps us to live rightly and courageously now. God's plan is to raise up his people, and God uses weak people to accomplish his plan. And then finally, nothing can keep God from fulfilling his plan for us. Nothing can keep him from doing it. Look with me at chapter 6, verse 14. These little chronological indicators in some of these verses are pointing us in a subtle way to the complex, precise, nuanced orchestration of these events by God. It says in verse 14, "While they were yet talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried to bring Haman to the feast that Esther had prepared." The author is careful to tell us that Haman is being ushered into Esther's feast while his family is telling him that the Jews are unstoppable. This is really important because it's going to be plain during the unfolding of events at this feast that Haman has been deeply affected and is fearful now based on what his friends and family have told him. So in chapter 7, verse 1, "So the king and Haman went into feast with Queen Esther. And on the second day, as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king again said to Esther, 'What is your wish, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom, it shall be fulfilled.'" Here is the key moment. Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted me for my wish, and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we'd been merely sold as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king. Esther has the courage to tell the king now, and her timing is perfect. Although Esther could not have designed this timing for herself, we've seen God working in the life of King Ahasuerus, in Mordecai, in Haman, and his friends. The king's eager to hear a request, and since the last feast, since yesterday, the king has been reminded of how much he owes to Mordecai the Jew. If she had presented this request at her first feast, he would not have had Mordecai on his radar at all. But here he is, having been freshly reminded the day before that he owes his life to Mordecai the Jew. It's unclear if he knows that Mordecai is Esther's uncle, but the Jews are on his radar in a favorable way. She's humble, but she's clear in her plea for mercy with the king. So in verse 5, then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, "Who is he and where is he who has dared to do this?" This is interesting because it shows a level of ignorance that we didn't maybe comprehend before in King Ahasuerus. That when Haman comes before him, some time before, weeks at least, and says, "Hey, I want to give you 10,000 talents of silver to let me annihilate all the Jews." The king says, "Well, I guess that's fine. I don't really know about them, and they sound kind of pesky based on what you're saying, so that's fine." And he doesn't give it a second thought. Because here, when Esther says, "I and my people are to be annihilated on a designated day," and he says, "Who has done this? What are you talking about?" And Esther courageously says this. She's been emboldened. Verse 6, and Esther said, "A foe, an enemy, this wicked Haman." And Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. It's funny, 2 days before, at the feast that Esther gives, just like this one, she's scared to say anything. She's intimidated by the king and by Haman. Not anymore. Now, this feast ends with Haman terrified of Queen Esther. The tables have turned. The king's in a fury, trying to figure out what to do. Verse 7, the king arose in his wrath from the wine drinking and went into the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther. The king doesn't know what to do. He's like, "I'm so mad. I have to take a walk. I need to figure out what I'm going to do about this." And Haman thinks, this is my chance to plead for my life. A couple days before, Haman has this incredible sense of confidence that he can do whatever he wants. Whatever his plans are, he's going to accomplish. Things are going his way. He's influential, he's clever, he's powerful. And now here he is in a room alone with Queen Esther. And his response to her is to beg her to spare his life. Things have really changed in 48 hours for Haman. And even the fact that Haman is there begging for his life to Queen Esther is a part of God's orchestration of how to bring these things to a conclusion. Because look at verse 8. And the king returned from the palace garden to the place where they were drinking wine, as Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. And we know that he's there pleading on his knees, "Esther, please." We can see him maybe grabbing at the hem of her royal garments or something. He's desperate. And the king said, "Will he even assault the queen in my presence, in my own house?" The king mistakes Haman's desperate pleading as some sort of physical assault on Esther from a distance. And that's it. As the word left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. They put a bag over his head to signify the fact that he was going to his execution. Haman's fate is sealed when the king mistakes him for assaulting the queen. And Haman's plan not only begins to fall apart, but to turn back on him. Verse 9, then Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance on the king, said, moreover, that is, Harbona is one of these people who's like rooting for Esther and her people. He says, actually, king, there's something, this is even worse, something you need to know about. Moreover, the gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, is standing at Haman's house 50 cubits high. Harbona joins in. He says, you'll never believe this, but Haman, who you've now decided is going to be killed, he built a stake to impale Mordecai on, the guy who saved your life. Can you believe it? It's at his house right now. And the king said, hang him on that. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the wrath of the king abated. The giant pole that he had built, 75 feet high, to impale Mordecai on, is where he is impaled by the king's servants because of Esther's plea. Even though Haman was one of the most powerful men in the Persian Empire, the most powerful empire in the world at that time, that is nothing compared to God's power to fulfill his purposes. It didn't matter how powerful Haman seemed from an earthly perspective. He was absolutely insignificant as an obstacle to God fulfilling his purposes for his people. We do not have to worry about anything in our situation threatening God's good plan for us. A dead-end job that frustrates us, a difficult marriage or close relationship, a chronic illness. No matter what kinds of humbling things we may have to weather now, we can rest knowing that God's plan for us is good. His plan to raise us up, to welcome us into his kingdom, to bring us into an eternal celebration with himself. And nothing, no matter how seemingly powerful it is, can change that. No matter what we might think of our life circumstances, God is always powerfully working out his good plan for his people. He always is. God uses weak people to accomplish his plan. Don't think for a moment that you are not qualified enough in some way for God to use you or to work in your life. God's plan is to raise up his people. If you fret about how things are going to turn out, you don't have to. Ultimately, things are going to turn out great for you. If you belong to Christ, things are going to be fine. Ultimately. And nothing can keep God from fulfilling his good plan for us. We don't have to wonder if we've messed up God's will for us or if someone else has or some situation has. It hasn't. No one can. Because nothing can stop God's good and powerful plan for his people. Let's pray together. Father, we're grateful for the encouragement that we see in your clear orchestration of events to raise up your people in the book of Esther. And we know that that is the God to whom we belong as Christian people today. Help us, God, no matter what our circumstances might be, to remember that you're in control of all things. That the circumstances that we cannot control do not worry you. And your plans for us are good. Help us to remember these things no matter what we may face this week. I pray in Jesus' name, amen.